On part 2 today. My name is Tessa Conroy. I'm an economic development specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the Department of Extension. I've been working on community economic development now for several years, but I mostly focus on entrepreneurship, thinking about what makes an entrepreneurial place, what makes Wisconsin different from Silicon Valley, different from Appalachia, and what can we do to foster entrepreneurial communities? And that's sort of the basics of the content that I'll be sharing with you. Last week was part 1. So in part 1, I tried to motivate why we would even be focusing on entrepreneurship. I like to start with why. So if you missed part 1 and would like to see it, it's posted at the link I just put in the chat, so you guys can get caught up if you would like to. And then today I think of as the what. So last week was why, this week is what, and then next week in part 3 will be so what. So with the what, we're going to be looking at a lot of data, a lot of charts, just getting the lay of land in terms of what's happening with entrepreneurship. So with that, I'll get started. So I'm starting with just some overarching trends, and then we're going to take a closer look at what happened during the pandemic. Then we'll take a closer look at businesses owned by people of color, and then last looking at businesses owned by women. So here we have establishment entry per 1,000 people. So the way I think of this is sort of given a small community of people or even a neighborhood, how many businesses might we expect to start? And then in dark red, we're looking at this for the US metro regions. Then in black, Wisconsin metro, and then the 2 dotted lines are the respective non-metro areas. So we can kind of compare rural to urban here. And what we see going back to the late 1970s is that birth rates have generally been declining. We see a pretty large drop with the Great Recession, kind of 2008, 2010. And birth rate activity seemingly hasn't really come back as of 2018. So that's the most recent year available. So the seemingly long-term trend downward for establishment entry, we might also call this the startup rate. And one thing I do want to point out in looking at this graph, though, is that we're talking about establishments with employees, that these are employer establishment births. We don't know a lot about the dynamics, so the entry and exit of small businesses, those without any paid employees. And I'll talk a bit more about that throughout the presentation, but starting with just this kind of general downward trend in startup activity. Another thing that I think is really important about startup activity is that startup tends to be highly correlated with exit or closure or failure, depending on your word of choice. So I think that's important because, as I pointed out last week, we know that entrepreneurship is associated with a number of economic benefits: job creation, income growth, poverty alleviation, sense of community, innovation. So all of these economic benefits. And I think sometimes we face a little bit of a policy challenge in terms of supporting entrepreneurship because we might think to ourselves, well, you know, a lot of these businesses are going to fail, so why might we focus resources on them? And I think it's just important to keep in mind that churn is part of an entrepreneurial economy. Dynamism is part of an entrepreneurial place. The same places that tend to have a lot of startup activity also tend to have a lot of failure. As long as that failure is coming alongside lots of innovation, people pushing the boundaries, we tend to see long-term benefits. In fact, we've seen that even in these places with the sort of dual high startup, high exit, in the long run, these places tend to have higher job growth. So I think that we should view failure as part of fostering a strong entrepreneurial community. Another feature of the business community in the US that I like to point out is that most businesses don't have any employees. So in the US, so we're looking at US on the left and Wisconsin on the right. In the US, less than a quarter of businesses have employees. The large majority are non-employers. So these are sole proprietors or perhaps business partnerships that don't have any paid employees. I think that's important to keep in mind because non-employer businesses can be a little bit harder to find, a little bit harder to see. They're maybe less likely to have a storefront, maybe less likely to be visible in terms of having a structure or signage. These are maybe a lot of contractors or perhaps coincide with the gig economy. So I think in terms of our efforts to foster entrepreneurship, thinking about these small businesses, knowing that's sort of the bottom of the iceberg, we might have to look a little bit harder to find those businesses. But they're really important because a lot of those businesses will eventually go on to hire employees. So in terms of thinking about an entrepreneurial pipeline or an entrepreneurial seedbed, these non-employers should be getting some of our attention as a really important part of the business community that could eventually have a lot of growth potential. Another aspect of the sort of employer non-employer split that I have found really interesting, especially since the Great Recession, is just the difference in the growth trajectory. So that's what I'm showing you here for Wisconsin and the US. So this is the growth from 2010 to 2018, again, most recent year available. And what we see is that whether we're looking at Wisconsin or the United States, that non-employers are really driving growth of businesses. I should point out that while non-employers dramatically outnumber employer businesses, they tend to be, of course, much smaller in terms of sales, and of course, don't have employees beyond the job that's created for the owner, him or herself, or the partners. So the economic presence of these businesses is smaller, but again, thinking about that pipeline and growth potential, the growth of this sort of entrepreneurial seedbed or the growth of the bottom of the iceberg is really interesting to me. And I think when we go back to that very first graph I showed you that had the decline in startup activity, that decline in establishment entry, that we were talking about businesses with paid employees. So this graph almost shows the opposite, that maybe if we were to track non-employer businesses, if we were to look at the startup rate of the very smallest types of business, we might actually see that accelerating as the number of businesses with paid employees goes down, that this is just part of a structural shift. And the data is still getting kind of caught up in terms of telling that story. So I don't know that for sure, but when I look at this difference in what's happening between employer and non-employer establishments, I can't help but think that this is perhaps part of the story of the gig economy, contractors, freelancers, that sort of thing. Another interesting feature of that non-employer growth is that it's mostly an urban phenomenon. So whether we're looking at Wisconsin here or the United States, most of that non-employer growth is happening in urban areas. When we look at non-metro compared to 2010, we're not really much above where we were before the Great Recession. So that's also interesting to me, perhaps features of urban economies that maybe have larger service sectors, for example, can help us understand that. But it's something that I would like to dig into and understand a bit better. If I were to include employer establishments on this graph, and I didn't because I just wanted us thinking about non-employers, we would see that employer establishments in Wisconsin have actually declined since the Great Recession, have actually gone down. So even though in non-metro areas, non-employer growth is relatively modest, it's the only growth because employer businesses have actually declined slightly since 2010. So important to pay attention to those non-employers. Before I dive into this section, I just want to pause and see, are there any questions on kind of that first overview, couple of slides? Did anything surprise anybody?
Tessa, so this is Chris here.
Hi, Chris.
The thing about I was surprised that rural areas are low in non-employer growth. I thought the phenomenon was actually flipped. I haven't studied it on a broader scale like you have, but the reason I thought that, for years I was looking at biless counties statistics, which seems to perhaps be an exception to the rural. After some of their big employers closed, including a cranberry food processor, probably about 1999, 2000. I just noticed that and this is the only thing I've really used is youreconomy.org, that one. But that non-employer growth really shot up for Vilas County, and it's maintained that. But it's also important to remember that Vilas County doesn't have any really large employers, large industries. It's ma and pa shops for the most part. So with something driving at Forest County, conversely, has so many large wood products manufacturing firms that they have a very low, they do have the, consistent with what you said, the very low non-employer growth rate, FYI.
I muted myself. Thanks for bringing that up, Chris. So one thing I will say is that, looking at state or national trends are always going to be outliers or differences from those averages. And I think bringing up Vilas is an important example of that potentially, because we've also seen, this is work that I did with Matt Cures and Steve, that we have communities that do have, for example, a high influx of what I call the near and newly retired. So, maybe 54 to 70 or so. And in those communities that maybe have high amenities, for example, we get this influx of near and newly retired people that we tend to see more entrepreneurial activity. And so it seems to be consistent with a story about sort of second career entrepreneurs, for example. So I do expect that there are places, and Vilas may be likely one of them, where we do still see quite a bit of non-employer activity. And Miles asked a question in the chat. He said, how do we know that the birth decline is statistically or otherwise significant? And I will admit, I didn't actually statistically test this particular chart, but in instances when I have, that has been statistically significant changes. So, and I can look at this particular graph as well and share that. All right. So with that, I think I will move on to this next section. So with looking at entrepreneurship in the pandemic, I'm pulling in some different data sources. So one is a new data source called the Business Formation Statistics. That's the first group of data I'll show you. And then the second is from the current population survey. So it's monthly data that comes out fairly quickly, so we can actually get a sense of what's happening in relatively real-time basis in terms of the pandemic. So with that, let's look at the business formation statistics. This is just for Wisconsin. And what they do is track business applications. So these are applications for an EIN, an employee identification number. And this goes back to 2004. So that's the beginning of the data set. And then as recent as June of 2021. And what we see in these sort of pandemic months is an acceleration of business applications. So in red is all business applications. So again, this pretty significant jump in business application activity. And then they break it out. So what I'm showing you in orange is what they call the high propensity business applications. So these are business applications that have the characteristics that they expect to make them highly likely to go on to actually hire employees. So these high propensity business applications, even though the numbers are lower, still accelerating during the pandemic months. And then in yellow, they're tracking how many of those actually do go on to become a business formation within 8 quarters. So there's that longer lag on this data to get that, allow for that 8-quarter window to happen. And so it'll be interesting to see if this increase in application does eventually amount to an increase in business formations. But this is really striking to me because it suggests an increase in startup activity like we haven't seen before. And this is quite different from the Great Recession. And the research says there could be several reasons for this. So initially, people wondered if this was even a data quirk, like what is going on here? And so is there a backlog of application data that's now kind of hitting the data set and we're seeing a spike? Is it because of new tax incentives that we have people trying to take advantage of new programs? And so that's explaining the surge. And what I've read most recently is that this recession has just been different, that whereas the Great Recession, we also had a collapse of sort of financial capital. We didn't see that. We had relatively healthy financial markets coming out of this recession. We've also seen a sort of fundamental shift in the economy in terms of what's available and what types of employment people are able to pursue, more working from home. And that's all made a difference in this in these applications for businesses. And then a third factor is that there has been an increase in stimulus dollars. And so for some households, this may have relaxed financial constraints and actually enabled people to pursue entrepreneurship in a way that they hadn't been able to before. So I think this is something we're still trying to understand, but a potentially exciting uptick in entrepreneurship that could signal any number of things about how the economy might be changing coming out of the COVID pandemic, or hopefully coming out of the COVID pandemic. So this is from the current population survey. So this is active self-employment in the United States. So you see this very clear precipitous decline in April of 2020 as things sort of locked down or shut down. We had any number of mandates across states. And so you see the dramatic effect that it had on people who are actively self-employed. But then a pretty robust recovery. By the fall of 2020, we were pretty much back to pre-COVID levels of self-employment in the economy, up around 15 million people. We see, again, a slight decline during the winter months, but again, a rebound and even slight uptick as we get into June 2021. So it does seem to be the case that entrepreneurship has more or less rebounded and is maybe even on an increasing trajectory like we hadn't seen prior to the spring of 2021. I think something that's important to keep in mind, though, is the composition of the self-employed, that there are different types of self-employed people. There are lots of ways we might think about that. The one that is most easy to consider using this particular data is the difference between incorporated versus unincorporated self-employed. So in very loose terms, we might think of unincorporated self-employed as a less formal type of business owner. And they've even been equated with more likely to be necessity entrepreneurs. So people that are pursuing entrepreneurship for lack of a good wage and salary opportunity, for example, generally have more modest performance trajectory in front of them. And then we have incorporated self-employed who generally have a more promising growth trajectory, that these are considered more formal, more serious, more likely to go on to be successful for any number of reasons. And what I'm showing you here is how that trajectory has changed during the pandemic months. So we see this increase in the unincorporated self-employed general uptick. And that's where actually a lot of the volatility happened. That was the big decrease in April of 2020. And then has now rebounded and is increasing. And then incorporated self-employment has been relatively stable, but if we were to track that line, that's actually a slight decrease. So even though entrepreneurship has seemingly recovered in total, I think the composition of entrepreneurs might be changing. We might have more people in this incorporated sector who might really benefit from some entrepreneurial programming that, seemingly have the beginnings of an entrepreneurial venture and perhaps could benefit from some coaching that might take them in a more formal or higher growth direction if that's consistent with their goals. So something to also keep in mind as we see this rise of entrepreneurship, the sort of different types of entrepreneurs and the context. We also saw big differences during the pandemic in terms of how people of color, business owners of color, were affected. So here I'm showing the change in active self-employed from February of 2020. So from February to April is the first bar, from February to May is the second bar, from February to June is the third, so that we're just always comparing to this February baseline. And we have various racial and ethnic groups going from left to right, and then I have the white population on the far right. So that's sort of our comparison group. So just to convey the differences, looking at, for example, the Black self-employed, Black or African-American, those were our largest decreases. As of April 2020, declined more than 40%. For Latinx, more than 30%. For Asian, around 25%. Foreign-born, again, relatively large decreases in that in those early months, upwards of 35%, whereas for the white population, the decreases were just over 15%. So the initial shocks being much larger for business owners of color than it was for the Native or white population. I think one thing to also notice, though, is that we seem to have pretty robust recovery among some populations, but less so in others. So it seems that Black or African-American business owners, relatively robust recovery by the fall. So the last bar we're looking at would be November 2020, which is actually above where we were in February, same for Latinx. But it does seem to be the case that for Asian and foreign-born, that these were much more persistent negative effects that we saw in terms of losing actively self-employed people in the economy. And for the white population, getting back to kind of equilibrium or where we were before the pandemic, and seemingly relatively stable in those last few months. So big differences across groups to be aware of. When we're thinking about why that might be, I think there are several explanations. I'll just offer one. So here I'm showing the business or how businesses owned by people of color are concentrated in different sectors. So these were the sectors that were among the most impacted by COVID-19 based on unemployment filings. And what we see is that, save at the American Indian population, Asian, Black and African-American and Hispanic business owners have relatively larger concentrations of their businesses in these sectors that were heavily impacted by COVID, oftentimes service sectors, for example. That's one of the largest. So that can help us understand why we saw some of those large effects for business owners of color during the pandemic. So before I go on to this next session, I'll just pause again and see if there are any questions or comments about sort of what happened during the pandemic.
Sorry, this is Brian.
Hi, Brian.
So when I'm looking at this particular slide, is that for individual entrepreneurs, or is that for American Indian, or is that for tribal sovereign nations?
So I am limited to how the survey of business owners names the category. So my understanding is that this would be any individual that identifies as American Indian on their survey response.
Okay.
All right. If there aren't any other comments, I'll go ahead and move on to looking more in depth at business owners of color. Okay, so a couple of facts just to start us off with that I find interesting and noteworthy. So the first is that from 2007 to 2012, keep in mind this is a 5-year period that encompasses the Great Recession. A net 2 million minority-owned businesses were created. And that's impressive, but it's, in my mind, especially interesting because during the same time period, a net 1 million minority-owned businesses closed. So during a period when all other categories of businesses are actually exiting, we have minority-owned businesses seemingly thriving. So from a research perspective, this is sort of something to pay attention to and what can be learned and What can we note about economic growth from minority-owned businesses during this economic down period? Perhaps there's something to be learned about resilience and shared more broadly. So something that I think was really sort of exciting and interesting. And then last is foreign-born individuals are more than twice as likely to start a business. So in a lot of our communities that have been diversifying over time, thinking about how we're welcoming to new individuals and not just new people, but new ideas, that this is a highly entrepreneurial population, that this could be a source of growth and vibrancy for our communities. So paying attention to these individuals as well as we think broadly about entrepreneurship is really important. So just starting here with the number of all minority-owned businesses per 1,000 residents classified as minority. So kind of what, given a population of people, how many of them might own a business, for example. And we look at this across states. So on average for the US, there are about 71 businesses per 1,000 population. We see that Florida is especially high, and it does tend to be higher on the coast. So where we more likely have diverse populations, we also tend to see higher rates of minority-owned business, generally lower as we move inward towards the middle of the country and north. We have Wisconsin at about half of the national average at 36.56 businesses. I would say Wisconsin is generally below the national average when it comes to various metrics of entrepreneurship. So if we were to say, look at the rate of business ownership for the total population, Wisconsin would be below average, but we're even further below average when it comes to looking specifically at businesses owned by people of color. So in Wisconsin, just as sort of a baseline graphic, we have the split of minority and non-minority business owned or firms. And as of 2017, the most recent we have, so 91% of businesses, about 400,000, this includes non-employers, are non-minority owned, and about 40,000 minority owned businesses in the state. When we think about, well, is that a lot or is that a little? So here by racial and ethnic group, we're comparing their share of total classifiable firms to the share of the population. So this graphic can help us think about parity. So if we were in parity using this tool, we might expect that if 10% of the population is Hispanic, that 10% of businesses would be Hispanic owned. And what we actually see is underrepresentation using this metric across every category. More modest underrepresentation for the Asian population, but much more exaggerated for Hispanic. So the largest disparity in absolute terms is for the Hispanic population, but if we were to take a ratio of the share of classifiable firms, so in red, to the share of population, we would see the largest underrepresentation among the American Indian or Native population. So just a way of helping us think about, well, is this sort of 9% a lot or a little? And comparing it to the population is one way to benchmark and think about parity. So that's sort of where we are today. I want to take a look though at sort of what is the trajectory. So I have 1997 through 2012 here. This is from the Survey of Business Owners, which is administered every 5 years, and it's years ending in 7 and 2. The survey changed as of 2017, and they changed methodology in a way that I can't compare 2012 to 2017, so that's why that's missing. But even if you look in this 15-year period from 1997 to 2012, you see an upward trajectory across the racial and ethnic groups that we're able to consider here. So, and especially dramatic growth among the Black or African American population, substantial for Hispanic and Asian, more modest for American Indian, but we do see growth across all categories. I think another thing to keep in mind, though, is yes, we've had this growth, this seeming traction for businesses owned by people of color, which is great for vibrant communities. But is this growth that just reflects population change? And so this graph is meant to help us understand, is this just a reflection of growing populations of color? So here we're looking at different states, and in red, we're looking at the growth of the minority population from 2012 to 2017. And then in orange, we're looking at the growth of employer businesses specifically from 2012 to 2017. So I had to wiggle a little bit with the data and focus on employer businesses so that I could use 2017. But this gives us a sense of, is business growth kind of over and above what's happening with the population, or is this simply a reflection of sort of having more people? And what you see in Wisconsin is that those track actually really very closely, that we have growth of our diverse population at about 10.29%, and then just below that 9.59% growth in employer businesses owned by people of color during that same time period. In other states, it's a little bit different. So if we look at Iowa, for example, the growth of employer businesses owned by people of color actually exceeds the growth of that population by quite a bit. So getting traction over and above something that just reflects changing demographics. So, maybe this would be attributable to certain industries or certain programs that have worked really well, a particularly entrepreneurial culture. It seems to be that Illinois is similar in this respect in terms of the growth of businesses exceeding population growth. And then we have other places like Michigan, where the minority population growth has actually exceeded what the growth of employer businesses has looked like. So we have entrepreneurship perhaps not keeping pace with population growth in a place like Michigan. So just a way of thinking about, well, what does this growth really mean for our states? So what we've done here is start looking at performance metrics. So in these first couple graphics, I was just looking at what are the numbers and sort of percentages. And here we're looking at, well, how does the performance of businesses owned by people of color compare to non-Hispanic white business or white-owned businesses? And so what I've done is calculate the average sales for a firm that is non-Hispanic white-owned, and then the average sales for each of the racial and ethnic categories that we're looking at, and then take in a ratio. So if we start on the far left, what this graph is telling you is that the average American Indian-owned firm earns 48 cents on the dollar earned by every non-Hispanic white-owned firm. The average Asian-owned firm earns 62 cents for every dollar earned in a non-Hispanic white firm. So it gives us a sense of the sales disparity between these different racial and ethnic groups. I think this is quite striking. As somebody who does a little bit of gendered analysis, we might often hear about the gender wage gap. So women earn 92 cents on the dollar for what the average male earns. So 92 cents per dollar that the average male owns. So if that were sort of a comparison, for example, these are much more stark differences than what we often hear about perhaps in the context of a gender wage gap. So there are lots of things that might explain this. This is ignoring in industry differences, for example. So, for example, it could be the case that non-Hispanic white-owned firms are more likely to be in manufacturing. Those tend to be higher earning firms. That businesses owned by Black or African-American entrepreneurs are more likely to be in the services. Those tend to be lower sales earnings. So some of those industry differences could certainly help account for the relatively large gap. But even with that in mind, I still think this is pretty striking. Here we're looking at that employer, non-employer breakdown again. I just think that that's important. So for minority-owned businesses in Wisconsin on the left, and then for non-minority-owned businesses on the right. And what we see is that non-minority owned businesses are much more likely to have employees. So about 1.5 times more likely to have employees. And I think that that's important to pay attention to because it might signal to us where some growth barriers are happening. So is it the case that minority business owners, when they go to hire their first employees or getting even to that stage when they might consider hiring their first employees is quite difficult, that we have more one-man and one-woman shops among business owners of color that are sort of primed for growth, that with the right resources could make it to that stage of being employers. So a lot of potentially low-hanging fruit in terms of economic growth and development as we have this large non-employer sector for business owners of color. Another thing that I think is important is to think about, okay, so let's just look at those businesses that do have employees. So focusing on employer businesses for each category, what we see is that businesses owned by people of color, once they do land in that employer category, seemingly do quite well. The average employment size is much more comparable if we were to benchmark against the non-Hispanic white than we were looking when we were looking at sales. So to me, this suggests that, you know, if businesses can reach that growth stage, that they actually, you know, go on to do quite well in terms of performance, much more comparable. Some of those barriers perhaps are relaxed. So perhaps focusing on the non-employers, getting the folks that are interested into that employer category, supporting that type of growth could be a really important barrier. Again, that was sort of the end of the section, so I'll just pause. It looks like there might be a few things in the chat, but I'm also open to hearing questions or comments. Patrick asked, how are businesses owned by a mix of races or ethnicities reflected in the data? So my understanding is that any businesses that is kind of 51% or more owned by a particular ethnic group, even if it's more than one person, racial or ethnic group, that would be counted in that category, for example. There are some categories of mixed race and ethnicity, but there tend to be so few businesses in those categories that I can't do a lot with that data, particularly at small geographies when we get down below state level, for example. Is earnings by race and ethnicity related to the sectors they are in? Yes, definitely. So as I mentioned, earnings tend to be lower in services, for example. Sometimes in retail, some of our more heavy industries, which have a lot of barriers to entry because they're very capital intensive, also though tend to have higher earnings. So certainly paying attention to those sectoral differences could help us understand those gaps.
Tessa, this is Brian. My question earlier in that process was about that one particular slide that did not have any native category on it, but I like what you have here the rest of the way.
Okay. Yeah, and Brian, that's a good point. I can go back and look at the why I don't have it. That might be an oversight on my part, or I'm just wondering what kind of options I have within the current population survey, but thanks for pointing that out.
Okay.
Yeah, Diana pointed out in the chat here that a lot of BIPOC, especially undocumented immigrants, are likely not to fill out the surveys that get us the data. So, so definitely, I think potential for undercounting a lot of business owners. All right. So with our last chunk of time here, I will just focus on women-owned businesses. This is the category I've probably spent the most time thinking about through research. And so anyway, I hope you find it interesting. The women-owned businesses. So again, starting off with just a couple facts that I think are interesting and worthy of our attention. And so women-owned businesses added roughly 500,000 employees in the decade preceding the recession. So from 1997 to 2007, Women-owned firms alone added about 500,000 jobs. I think that alone is noteworthy, but this came at a time where male and co-ed owned businesses actually had a net loss of jobs. So what was happening during this period that women-owned businesses were seemingly so successful, whereas other categories were struggling to maintain employment? So probably several answers to that question. I can think of one being that women are concentrated, for example, in health and education, and those are two sectors that tended to do quite well at that time, whereas manufacturing was declining, for example. But just something, again, to observe and for us to pay attention to in terms of understanding the different types of entrepreneurs and opportunities and sources of economic growth. So women-owned businesses have been growing consistently. We have the United States on the left and then Wisconsin on the right. Difference in scale. So we have, for the United States, women-owned firms growing in millions and then in thousands for the state. But in general, pretty consistent growth. But to me, when I look at these graphs, most of the growth is happening in the orange category, which are the non-employer businesses, whereas the red category, the employer businesses, have been relatively stable. So that's consistent with the trends we saw earlier in this presentation too, that we have pretty dramatic growth of non-employer businesses, whereas we have more modest growth of employer businesses when we're looking at sort of the early 2000s up until recently. Here we're, rather than looking at the level or the number of businesses, we're looking at the growth rate and comparing the growth rate for women-owned firms to male-owned firms. And what we have is Wisconsin on the left-hand side of the chart and the United States on the right. And then within each sort of half of the graph, women and men next to each other. So for example, looking at Wisconsin, from 2002 to 2007, women-owned firms grew by 7.9%. At the same time, male-owned firms actually declined by just over 4%. During the next period we're looking at, which had pretty rapid growth, 19% for women-owned firms and just 11% for men, which is still, positive growth. But I think what sticks with me from this graph is that regardless of the period that we're looking at, and regardless of whether we're looking at the state of Wisconsin or the US, women-owned firms generally grew faster than male-owned firms. So again, kind of digging into understanding why that is it the sectors within which women-owned firms are concentrated? So education, health, for example, doing quite well, whereas perhaps other sectors that tend to be male-owned or concentrated with male-owned firms not doing as well. Is there something specific about women-owned firms in terms of management practices? So for example, through our research, we found that women-owned businesses are less likely to lay off employees during an economic downturn. And that at the community level, what that means is that during the Great Recession, communities that had more women-owned firms actually had a more stable recession. So they didn't decline as rapidly as places with fewer women-owned firms. So it could be the case that there are, observational differences on average between men and women-owned firms that we could learn from and might help us support entrepreneurs of all types. Here we're looking at that rate of ownership again. So we're just taking the number of women-owned businesses divided by the female population, so per 1,000 females. The way I think of this again is kind of given a community of women or a neighborhood, how many of these women might we expect to own businesses as sort of a way to think about this statistic. And what we see is that Wisconsin sits at just about 67 businesses per 1,000 women. And that's relatively low. Most of the Rust Belt is relatively low, sort of save Illinois, that we tend to see much higher rates of women-owned businesses in places like Colorado, California, Florida. Interestingly, Georgia is sort of an outlier there, and parts of the South as well. So just a way of seeing this variation across places. And this is something I'm interested in my research is sort of what makes these places that have higher rates of female-owned businesses, what makes them different culturally, in terms of the financing community, what is different about these places that could explain the difference or the higher rate of female-owned business. Women-owned businesses, like businesses owned by people of color, are more likely to be non-employers. So again, we said for the country, about 23% of all businesses are non-employers, are employers, whereas here just 10% of women-owned businesses are employers. Rather, we have 90%, so the large majority of women-owned firms being non-employers. So a lot of one woman shops, or perhaps two women who are partners in a business. Those are much more common for women than other types of businesses. And it's relatively comparable between the US and Wisconsin. So here, this gives us a chance to look at what some of you brought up for the businesses owned by people of color. We can actually look at 4 women-owned businesses and think about the sectors. So here we're looking at each different type of firm. So in red is the share of female-owned employer businesses in a given sector. In orange is the share of male-owned employers in a given sector. And then in yellow are businesses that are equally male, female owned. So, a husband-wife partnership might be one example of that, but there are others. And what we see is that for employer firms, women are most likely to be in healthcare and social assistance. Male-owned businesses far less common in that sector. When we look at something like construction, which is kind of in the middle of the page, that's the opposite. We have far more male-owned businesses and far fewer female-owned businesses. And that might also help us understand some of the sales gaps that we're going to look at in the subsequent slides. Real estate is a sector that, is more comparable, but still relatively female dominated. What are some of the other interesting trends that I'm looking at? Professional, scientific, and technical services, also more female dominated. Before spending too long, though, I want to pivot to the non-employers, because this is where most women-owned firms is in this sort of non-employer sector. So here, just simplifying things a little bit, among non-employers, there just aren't very many male-female partnerships. So we left out that category because it was so trivial. But what we see is a lot of women in the service sector. We see a lot of women, again, in healthcare and social assistance, a lot of women in professional, scientific, and technical services, but that's actually fairly even male-female split. Retail is much more female dominated. So we can start to see these really strong sectoral differences. Construction, transportation, and warehousing, that's where the split goes the other direction in favor of male-owned businesses. So just a little context here in terms of where women-owned businesses are landing. And then this is the share of employer businesses in each revenue bucket. So we have Wisconsin on the left and then the United States on the right. And again, these various categories of employer businesses and the size distribution of firms. So for example, looking at Wisconsin, the red bar is pretty high in the 10,000 to 49,999, pretty large in the 50,000 to 99,999, and then pretty large in the 100,000 up to just about 250,000. So women are kind of concentrated in the size categories on the left-hand side more so. And then you see men-owned businesses kind of have this spike in businesses with $1 million or more in revenue, and women being less common in that category. So important differences in terms of where these businesses land that might, partly have to do with their sector, among other things as well. Similar with the non-employers, you see that I'm just going to look at Wisconsin here. On the right-hand side, we see that the red bar, which is the share of women-owned non-employers, is much taller in the smallest category. So businesses, let's say earning under 25,000, women are much more common in those sectors, whereas when we get above 25,000, it tips the other way. The orange bar is taller, so we have more men in those high earning businesses, more than 25,000, but well beyond 250,000 in revenue. So this is the graph that I showed you before, where we're for people of color, where we're looking at what is the average sales in a male-owned firm and taking a ratio of that with the average sales in a female-owned firm. So what this says to you on the left-hand side here is that the average female-owned employer establishment earns 50 cents per dollar earned in the average male-owned employer establishment. So again, pretty stark earnings differences, even more so for the country as a whole. When we look at the graph on the right, those disparities are even a little bit larger when we look at female-owned firms at 46 cents per dollar. And then it actually flip-flops for the equally male, female-owned category. But I just wanted to show this difference across types of ownership. Again, looking at the non-employer businesses, so same graph, but just looking at non-employer businesses, and we see these persistent sales gaps. So 42 cents on the dollar for women compared to men, and 48 cents on the dollar for women compared to men nationally. And then last, looking at the employment figures. So among employer firms, which keep in mind are far less common for women-owned businesses, the average female-owned business with employees has almost 11 workers, so 10.72, compared to almost 16 for men. So we still have a significant size gap, but not as large a gap as we might think in terms of percentages for what we saw with sales. Similarly, nationally, we see that female-owned firms have about 9 employees nationally, and then male-owned establishments having close to 13. So still a noticeable gap, but not quite as severe or stark as what we saw with sales. So again, I think this might point to a story that, in terms of employment, once women hit that stage of growth, they perform more comparably to male-owned firms, but I still think there are important differences to be explained that might have to do with sector, but it might also have to do with management preferences, goals of the organization. There's some evidence, for example, that women are less profit-oriented and more oriented towards employee well-being and those sorts of metrics, and that makes a difference in terms of their size and growth trajectory. So with that, that's my last section, and it looks like we have a couple minutes for questions and comments, maybe on this women-owned section or on the presentation as a whole. I'm happy to answer questions, but again, with today, I just wanted to kind of give a lay of the land in terms of where we are and overall trends.
Tessa, to my simple mind of, I don't follow this closely, none of this seems surprising to me. What are your major takeaways? When you look at this, is there something like, oh, I didn't know that, or this is what I really need to be paying attention to, or these are the opportunities we need to look into?
Yeah, so a couple of takeaways or sort of top line items for me are the change in non-employer firms. So that growth has been really dramatic, and I'm doing some research on that right now, actually 2 projects in the works. And what we're finding is that the rapid growth of non-employer businesses seems to be linked to diverse populations. So the counties that are more diverse, so larger populations of a larger Hispanic population, a larger Black or African American population, that those places are experiencing the most growth in terms of non-employers. So that's really interesting. Is this a story about the labor market, and perhaps these communities are facing particular barriers in the wage and salary market. So they're hopping out of wage and salary positions into entrepreneurship as a way to avoid those barriers and perhaps a more promising path. And they have more autonomy, more independence. So that's one thing that I think is really interesting. And then another that I think is really interesting is that we have these declining birth rates over time, but then we also have this surge of entrepreneurship like we haven't seen after a recession in the past. So that's really fascinating. So compared to the Great Recession, we have this huge spike in business applications. So in 2 years, are we going to see a surge of entrepreneurial activity, of new businesses? What does that mean right now for economic development practitioners? Do we have a lot of people who are actively working on their businesses right now who could use support? When I look at what's happening for business owners of color, that is worrisome for a lot of reasons, but one is that we seem to have these years of growth, and true, maybe that's on track with population, but at least there is growth. And yet then we had the pandemic hit, and the pandemic was most severe for business owners of color. So are we talking about losing decades of growth because of the pandemic, and how do we restore those businesses, those communities, so that they can get through a hard economic time? So that's another thing that's really concerning to me. In terms of women-owned businesses, one of the things that I am, what do I want to say, curious about, or that grabs my attention, is the persistence of the gaps. So in terms of like labor force participation, in terms of wages and earnings, women have sort of continued to do better and better, if that makes sense, or kind of catch up. And the story of catching up seems to be losing momentum. It seems to be stalling a little bit. And maybe that's a story about preferences. Maybe we have reached a point sort of saturation, but have we still some barriers that need to be identified and worked on? So those are all the things that are, well, not all the things, but some of the things that are going through my mind when I look at these data. But thanks for the question, Miles. Any other comments or questions? We are just about on time. Lori, I think we could go ahead and stop the recording. I can hang out for a minute in case anybody wants to linger, but otherwise we'll get you out of here on time.